LinkedIn presents.
I'm Rufus Griscom, and this is The Next Big Idea. Today, part 2 of my conversation with astrobiologist Sara Walker about the physics of life's emergence. If you've listened to the first part of my conversation with Sara and you're back for more, I'm impressed. Those are some wonderfully dense rants on the nature of existence. And guess what? Part 2 takes it up a notch. But first, a little recap. You will recall that Sara Walker is 3.8 billion years old. So are you, because we are more than the carbon-based matter out of which we're made, which is, after all, not that special. It's the same stuff that plants, rocks, and stars are made of. What is alive in us is the set of instructions through which our bodies constantly rebuild themselves, which is only possible because of the multi-billion-year lineage through which each of us was selected for. In the episode you're about to hear, Sara and I talk about the technosphere, synthetic biology, and artificial intelligence. We also explore the ways in which imagination is a physical act, just as everything in our material universe is physical, resulting in downstream consequences. So we must imagine and we must embrace an optimistic theory of physics, Sara tells us, and a vision of our collective future, because optimism exerts a force on the physical world, a force in the direction of the world in which you and I would like to live. Oh, and of course we talk about aliens. We can't leave out the aliens. But we began by discussing consciousness. That's coming up after a quick break.
From LinkedIn News, I'm Jessie Hempel, host of the Hello Monday podcast. Start your week with the Hello Monday podcast. We'll navigate career pivots. We'll learn where happiness fits in. Listen to Hello Monday with me, Jessie Hempel, on the LinkedIn Podcast Network or wherever you get your podcasts.
I'm Tomer Cohen, LinkedIn's Chief Product Officer. In my new podcast, Building One, I interview some of the best product builders out there. People at the intersection of dreaming and building and learning. Together, you and I will learn from their experiences. If you're just as curious as I am, follow Building One wherever you listen, and check out the conversation on LinkedIn.
You've said that consciousness is a particularly concentrated example of what life is doing more broadly.
Yes.
So what do you mean by that?
So the idea is, like, if you regard life as these lineages of these constructive processes, these trajectories in the assembly space that are co-constructing, and they're getting into, spaces of larger and larger possibilities, so there has to be more and more history to get there. The things that are deepest in time, I think, are where consciousness emerges. I think one of the reasons that we can think so abstractly is we're so deep in time that a lot of the structure that is us doesn't exist in sort of the spatial dimension or like what feels physical in the now. It actually is this causal structure that's rolled up in us that's very large in time. And so I think for me, consciousness is a natural continuity of this process, but the deeper and deeper you get, the more and more abstract the reality around you looks and the way that you feel about the reality, because you're now looking at things that feel very close in spatial proximity, but they might be very far away in time. And I think this is why so much of the reality that humans interact with seems abstract. And when we traditionally talk about information, one of the reasons it's really hard to talk about in physics is it doesn't seem like it's a material property, going back to the discussion we had before. It's like if I say words to you right now, they're carried over airwaves to my microphone, and then they're, turned into an electric signal in the computer, and then they're carried over on the internet to wherever all of you are listening, and then they get, output to you as auditory or a visual signal and then repattern in your brain and you somehow understand what I'm saying. It's the same information. Like, how does that work? And it seems very abstract because it seems substrate independent is the way that people usually talk about it in physics. And what I think is happening is that it's not substrate independent. The substrate is time. That substrate is the causal history embedded in those objects. And we have a hard time seeing that because our sensory perception is very much generated to talk about the here and now, like our immediate responses for our survival, and not looking at this larger causal structure that we're embedded in that actually is the thing that generated us. And so for me, that's the key part. And so I think our consciousness is a part of that structure. And indeed, if you look in consciousness science, like most of the theories about consciousness we have now are somehow related to causal structure. But not really thinking about this depth in time. They're still kind of in a Newtonian kind of perception of dynamical systems, which I think is problematic.
So when I think about the emergence of consciousness, maybe I come at it from more of a sort of armchair evolutionary biology kind of perspective. But here's what to me makes sense about sort of the emergence of human consciousness is when you think of the evolution of humans, the survival of our ancestors required us to develop understandings of what was likely to happen in the future. And the most important environment was, or possible occurrences, was the behavior of other humans, right, that might kill us or might try to help us. So we had to develop a theory of mind and understanding of the psychology of other humans and understand them and predict their future behaviors. And at some point, we turn that comprehension back to ourselves to understand ourselves.
Right.
And in order to better predict future outcomes, it was useful to have conversations with ourselves, talking through all the possible future outcomes, right? So we end up with these creatures that have a concept of ourselves and others and are in conversation with ourselves. For me, the harder piece is understanding why we feel like we're inside our skulls in a somatic, visceral way, right?
Yeah.
But so I think of consciousness emerging in that context. I guess you're describing it on a species level.
I come at it not so much from this sort of social evolution of why we have the attributes we do, but thinking about it at, sort of a much deeper level of abstraction. Of course, it must be consistent with that, right? Like these narratives cannot in the end be inconsistent.
Yeah.
But for me, I've thought a lot more about, how would you measure consciousness? And there's the hard problem of consciousness. Like if it's this subjective internal thing, it's not actually amenable to scientific study as an objective measurement. And so for me, where consciousness becomes, actually this does intersect with what you're saying quite nicely, is where consciousness might become a measurable attribute is actually to think about it as a collective property, like to measure its collective effects.
Right. Yes.
And so, and I think this is actually ultimately how we will get to theories of consciousness, that they will never be theories of single minds. They will be theories of collections of minds that are interacting with the physical world. And the fact that those collections of entities have subjective experience means the way the collectives act is very different than if they didn't have subjective experience.
Yeah.
So I think we're sharing experiences all the time through language is exactly your point, but the manifestation of that internal processing and the way it comes out in these abstract ways of representation and language only plays out over many generations in social phenomena and the way that societies construct possibilities that are not possible unless the entities they're composed of have inner worlds. I think social evolution actually, I'm totally coming around to agreeing exactly what you said, is the only context for understanding what a mind is. And if you treat it in sort of the typical neuroscience way where you're trying to look for like where consciousness is in a neuron, it's the wrong level of interrogating measurable properties of that phenomena.
Turning back to free will, the reason I have trouble getting to a belief in free will, and we've discussed this on the show with Sam Harris and Robert Sapolsky and others, is, so we know from quantum mechanics that there's this sort of subatomic level of indeterminacy, but how this sort of subatomic indeterminacy would self-organize into the autonomous volition of a single organism is, for me, like a huge stretch. And so here, one additional description, and then you can correct me or describe your view. But we were talking earlier about the sense in which all boundaries, right, between fields of science and even between individual objects or people are somewhat arbitrary, right? That really the universe is kind of patterns in the flow of energy transformation or the motion of matter, if you prefer. And so in the same sense that we see like, a sequence of waves rolling onto a beach, right? I could give a wave a name. Well, that's Rufus and that's Sara, right? And they're visually distinct, but they're obviously part of a pattern of the motion of molecules that's part of this larger flow of matter and energy. Mm-hmm. And so it feels to me, as a non-scientist, by the way, right? I mean, this is just me as someone with an armchair curiosity about all this, that that we exist in this kind of in-between scale space in which it's logical to talk about individual objects, but from a broader perspective, it's all sort of flow of energy, and there's no individual, object that is autonomously independent of everything around it, initiating new actions.
Yeah, I have a lot to say on this, but your visual is nice, and I think what's odd about it to me, using the analogy you did, is you're using a spatial analogy for a phenomena that's inherently only different in like the dimension of time, not space, right? So. Yeah. You and I are separated in time. Like that is the thing that distinguishes us, is the lineages of construction that led to two different individuals and the life histories we have that led to us being in this particular conversation. It's time that differentiates us. Like I could come and just, stand almost in an identical position in space. That's not going to like it's all the time embedded in the object. And I think when we're thinking about the problem of free will, I mentioned the part that we think about the determinism, or we think the universe is totally random and non-deterministic, which is like the quantum story. Yeah. But the way I think about it is determinism emerges along these lineages. So you're talking about one structure that's fully deterministic, and there's one rule that describes the whole thing, these waving phenomena, right? And I'm saying that's actually not right. The universe doesn't have a universal rule. It has constraints built up over time that are embedded in the physical things we observe. And so if you instead think about it as the lineages become deterministic, and you have a bunch of lineages that are deterministic interacting with each other, but they're always, they have this structure and time about how they're interacting, and there's a non-deterministic background underlying that. There's always room for a little causal control over those trajectories. Like and the space is getting larger as these things are interacting. So you're getting more and more determinism as you're getting more biological structure and more social interactions, right? Like I'm really determined by the social context in which I live, from the fact that like I color my hair blonde to, I have a cell phone that I check every 5 minutes. Like those are epic constraints on my social architecture that come from the current moment in time I live in. But they also give me opportunities for other exertion of causal control I wouldn't have had 100,000 years ago. Like I can, book a flight and be on a plane and be in New York City tomorrow if I wanted to. Yeah. Right. So the free will issue is it's always discussed in the determinism of the spatial now, and not in the determinism of the temporal depth and so free will is something that's executed. It's a process that happens in time, and it's about the interplay of the determinism and the structures that exist and the undeterminism and the structures that don't exist, and how that system constructs in the future. And there's always a little wiggle room. And I do think that free will is differentially distributed. I think some people execute more free will than others. And so I think thinking again, it's like we think about it as this black or white thing. It's fully determined. It's random. People have free will or they don't. And actually, it's a spectrum of causal interactions and processes that can be executed over time, because there is the future is not determined yet. It's just not determined. There's not enough information to fully determine the future.
Yeah. Well, I for one am buoyed by your faith in there being some degree of free will, and also there being varying degrees of free will is kind of cool. So a conversational shift. Mm-hmm. Aliens, Sara. We were promised aliens. Where are the aliens?
I didn't promise any aliens unless we're making them in the lab. But I don't. So what's the question?
So the question is, okay. So to give it a little more of a lead in here, many people listening are familiar with the Fermi paradox. Our planet is not that unusual. And yet there's this great silence in the universe. We appear to be the only living creatures as far as we can tell. is the absence of evidence of absence, right?
No. Yeah. Yeah, I think not at all. And I did talk about sort of some of my views on that in the book about this idea of a great perceptual filter, and that's not all that different than things people have said before. Like maybe we just haven't seen the aliens yet. Like we're searching a small volume of space. But what I really tried to think about was embedding it more again in this idea of historical context, and that we're a biosphere that is learning and evolving and in part of that evolution is building better technologies to see the world, just like eyes evolved early in the history. You know, now we have microscopes and telescopes to see the world in deeper ways than even biologically evolved or now technologically evolved. And so I think because we don't understand fundamentally the phenomena of life, we literally cannot see it.
Yeah.
And the analogy that I make is with the phenomena of gravitational waves and making first contact with gravitational waves, which I purposefully use first contact because it's an alien phenomenon in the universe, like not life, but it's something we didn't know of, and we actually had to develop technology to detect. So there we had a theory proposed by Einstein, in the early 1900s, predicting the existence of gravitational waves, but it took us 100 years to build the technology to quote unquote see them.
Yep.
And the gravitational waves have been permeating this planet as long as life has been on this planet. And it's the first time in the evolution of 4 billion years that we have the technology of sight to see gravitational waves. And our biosphere has evolved sensory perception for gravitational waves. And I think that lens of it actually gives us a little bit better framing because it depersonalizes it, like it doesn't make it about us in the current moment using radio technology, but really thinking more fundamentally about what is the process of life on a planet and how does life evolve to perceive reality and measure and detect things. And are we at the stage that we should actually even expect to see aliens yet? We might not be able to.
Yeah. Discovering new forms of life has always required new forms of technology.
That's right.
Right. And the technology keeps coming.
Yes. Yeah.
And there might be a shadow biosphere.
Could be. Yeah.
And what is that? What's that? What's a shadow biosphere?
The shadow biosphere is the idea that alien life might be right here on Earth. And by alien, it would then be an independent origin. So right now we have evidence that all life on Earth is related by common ancestry. So that's evidence of only one origin of life. There could have been multiple ones on our planet that died out and we don't have. But there was a conjecture about this idea of a shadow biosphere as maybe being a better way of looking for alien life. And indeed, for the reason you're saying, like we've detected life with new technology in the past, right? Like microbial life we didn't know about till we built the microscope. And then viruses were even harder to detect. We had to build a lot of kind of materials because you can't even see them in a microscope, right? Like, so you have to detect them as like particulate matter and filters and things like that. So it's possible there could be some other biosphere of some other kind of microscopic organization that we haven't detected. And in the case of cellular life and viral life, they've been shown to have the same biochemical architecture. But if we detected something that had different biochemistry, didn't use DNA, for example, that would be really suggestive of an independent origin. So that's sort of the idea. And some people are looking for it. Some people argue not as many people as should be looking for it. My postdoc advisor, Paul Davies, was a big proponent of looking for the shadow biosphere, at least alongside sending missions to other planets to look for alien worlds, because it's a lot cheaper.
You're right. Exactly. It could be right here under our noses or in our noses.
That's right. That's what Paul said. Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that quote.
Well, there's a great saying, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, which I understand to mean the development of an individual human looks oddly like the evolution of our species. And it's occurred to me that, maybe technology recapitulates phylogeny.
Yes.
Right. That watching like the iPhone and Apple Vision Pro progress, you can tell I'm an Apple person. It's occurred to me has kind of mirrored human evolution, right? Increasingly precise visual capabilities, three-dimensional perception through triangulation, receptivity to touch through touch screens, right? Layers and layers of kind of rebuilding our capacities and then magnifying them and expanding on them. It's kind of wild to watch that happen and the pace of it. Right. I mean, it's an extraordinary moment to be doing what you're doing, and the things that you're doing with Lee Cronin and his lab are extraordinary. And what those will look like in 10 years it will be even more extraordinary. Right. And it's possible that the first contact with alien life might be with alien life that we create.
Yes. So this is the thing that I'm very excited about, because I think it's a much more tractable scientific way of approaching the search for alien life. So if you look at the field of astrobiology and how we look for alien life right now, a lot of people are enthusiastic about exoplanets, and I am too. Like I spend part of my lab works on exoplanets. I have a very excellent PhD student right now whose primary focus is on exoplanets. But the problem with solar system searches for life or exoplanets is we don't know the likelihood of life, and we don't know what life will look like on those worlds. And if you take this argument about like geochemical, like the geochemistry on a planet is already exploring a vast space, like it's not a priori obvious that life on other worlds will look anything like life on Earth. And so, by trying to look at this sort of deeper principles approach about thinking about life fundamentally as how the universe builds complexity and how that starts to happen on a planet as a cascade of events of building more complex objects, that's quite general and can apply to alien chemistry just like it can apply to biology as we understand it. And so the idea of solving the origin of life, I think, is also the same idea as understanding the likelihood of life emerging in the universe, which is also the same idea as making first contact. And so basically trying to do is collapse the problems of astrobiology into one tractable question to get at all of these things. Like, what is the likelihood of life in the universe? Can you build an experimental program where you search large volumes of chemical space to look for an origin of life event? If that origin of life event happens, it's probably not going to be chemistry as you know it, because the space is huge. It's going to be a different chemistry, which means it's an alien. You made an alien in the lab. Now, it's not fully an alien because of the contingency in evolutionary history and the information in the experiment, right? It will still be part of the lineage of life on Earth. And so the challenge of origin of life is actually to remove our agency from the experiment, which is super hard. There are a few places in science where the fact that we are living things in the universe doing experiments really matters. One of them is origin of life, because we put selection and goal-directed behavior into our experiments, trying to make molecules like life as we know it, instead of doing these unconstrained things. Another one is consciousness, where it's like the subjectivity, like how do you actually experimentally probe that? And the other one is quantum physics, where it's very clear that the observer is doing something by doing the experiment.
Yes.
So,
yes.
So I think we see this in the hard problems. But anyway, long story short, I think those experiments are tractable. I think we can control for the agency we put in the experiments. Assembly theory has formal ways of talking about complexity in, complexity out, and how to quantify what we put in terms of the selectivity as evolved entities that already exist. And therefore, I think it's possible with the technology that Lee's been building to do origin of life experiments at scale and solve the problem. That's what we'd like to do.
Might there be a be careful what we wish for situation here?
There always is a be careful what you wish for kind of scenario. And a colleague of mine who's a philosopher of technology, Ben Bratton, likes to point out the best ideas are equally terrifying and optimistic. And I'm a total optimist. I actually think that existentially we need to understand what we are. Otherwise, we're never going to be able to deal with the technological transitions that we're mediating and all the things happening on our planet. But I do recognize that with any new set of ideas, whether they're scientific or otherwise, that we encounter, we can't predetermine all of the consequences of them. And I don't know what some of those consequences will be. And I can understand why there should be trepidation about some of them. And I think that will be a problem that we also have to address. But I think the future is coming whether we want it or not.
Yes.
And therefore, we should really develop ideas that are going to help us confront it.
Right. And if we're interested in aliens, we should accept that they are likely to be weirder than we can imagine.
Absolutely.
Which is why we need to be systematic about, I mean, which is why maybe artificial intelligence can help us with computers, with these sort of synthetic biological machines.
Yeah, and you have to be careful because AI is very easy to teach that reality doesn't exist because it'll learn whatever you label your data as. But I think so. I wouldn't say AI is the solution. I think it's a tool that we can use to help us with all of the data we have to do, as long as we have a proper theoretical infrastructure for understanding what we're looking for, which is the whole idea of having the assembly theory framework. But that being said, I think there's also, it's not just about the origin of life, right? So the idea of this physics and the idea of studying the transition of the origin of life in this way also has a lot of other implications. And some of them are just, like fundamental technology that needed to be developed for solving the origin of life. So this computer is, a technology that was developed to solve the origin of life as a chemical search problem, but it's critically important as a technology for drug discovery. And this is actually how Lee has funded the computer, and also how he's aiming now with his company Chemify, which I like, in full disclosure, is like a commercial company. I'm not advertising it for the sake of the commercialization of it. I'm like, I'm just deeply interested in intellectually, what the idea is.
And you're an advisor to the company.
I am an advisor. So, but the reason that I'm excited about it is the idea of the company was to try to scale the technology quickly to be able to solve this origin of life problem. So that was Lee's motivation. Now, the implication of that is this idea that you would be able to have robots basically perform all of chemical synthesis. And so most drug manufacturing right now is done by humans, actually in China, in a place called Wuxi, and also some in India. But like it's literally done by hand. Like you need a physical human chemist with the expertise to make a molecule. And if you think that you could automate the process and have robots that are doing using digital chemistry to do chemical synthesis, and they can do it at scale, like that opens up a huge amount of territory in drug design and potential for pharmaceuticals in a way that hasn't been conceivable in the past. And actually, a lot of people want to do AI for drug discovery, and they don't know how to make the molecules.
Yeah. Right.
So unless we have this technology, none of that is going to go anywhere.
And this is happening now, right? And you said that you think some of the most disruptive technologies in the coming decades will come out of these efforts, right?
Yeah, I think so. So I think what I really, and part of the reason of me pointing this out is I think it's a good example of something that should happen when you're doing really fundamental science that really could lead to breakthroughs and transformations in our understanding, is that the technology and the theories and the ideas are going to co-evolve. And so my point with it is we should expect, if the origin of life is being solved, that we will see radical transformations culturally in how we think about the nature of life, which is what I spent a lot of time working on. We should expect radical transformations in the technologies that are associated with that kind of process. And that we should expect all kinds of other things to be happening globally, like not just with, like I use our collaboration as an example of that, but I just think that's a general social phenomena that you should expect when there's a major transition. I think there's a lot of players, potentially in different spaces around the planet in the we live in such an interesting time. It's just cool to be alive right now.
Have you been feeling the effects of stress, burnout, or anxiety at work? Workplace culture is changing, but we're not done yet. Listen to the Anxious Achiever podcast to rethink the relationship between your career and your mental health. Hear stories from psychologists, entrepreneurs, even athletes and celebrities. Learn how they balance success and ambition with staying mentally healthy, and walk away with practical advice you can implement today. Get The Anxious Achiever wherever you find your podcasts.
Your perspective, Sara, on AI is fascinating to me. We spent a fair amount of time on AI on this show. We talked with Bill Gates and Yuval Noah Harari and Stuart Russell and all kinds of interesting people. But your perspective is singular in that you've described language as a kind of life form. Like we could think of language, our collective global language, as a kind of life form. You talk about the connection of the internet as a global entity, as a kind of evolutionary process, and then AI coming on top of those of the evolution of language and the global internet to process it on a scale that's impossible for humans, is effectively creating, would you say, a kind of planetary scale intelligence? It's not, I mean, because we think of it as it's intelligence that's like competing with the intelligence of an individual human. But I think that the way that you describe it is on a totally different scale. Is that fair?
Yeah. And I've used planetary intelligence in the past, but I think like the word intelligence is so loaded that I feel a little trepidatious using that as and I've done a lot of work in this space, and like people have different ways of talking about this thing, like whatever it is. Like, is it a cognitive infrastructure or something like Antikythera team that Ben Bratton Heads has thought about, and it's difficult to have a language for it. But I think the way that I think about the nature of life is obviously conceptually quite deep, which means it's conceptually quite broad. And so I don't really draw a boundary between biology and technology as evolutionary processes. And in fact, that's very consistent in general with how people think about things in complex systems field. Like they've been drawing analogies between biology and technological processes for decades, and it's a really fruitful area. Yeah. I think this idea, though, of thinking about these things is getting deeper and deeper in time, and that life is not a scale-specific phenomena. It's not like a cell is a fundamental unit of life. It's the lineages that are fundamental units of life. Makes a continuity between us and the technology we build that is not apparent to most people when they're talking about these things, because we tend to talk about AI as other. We're building an other intelligence. Yeah. And that whole idea is so perplexing to me that this is the language that we use. Like it's almost like everyone thinks they're the only mind that exists in the universe, and suddenly they're presented with like talking to this other thing, and they realize there's at least two minds in the universe. It's like, it's very weird. It was interesting when you were giving this, like when people started having social systems and talking to them, they could understand their own mind better. I guess, now we're building systems that we can talk with in different ways. But I think that I think language is not what we think it is.
How so?
Well, I find very perplexing that oftentimes we confuse representations in our mind with the thing in the world. And we do this all the time. I give like kind of silly examples of it just to make obvious parallels to how I think. So like I think one of them I've given a few times is like thinking about Santa Claus, right? Like when I say Santa Claus, you have in your mind an image of a person at the North Pole with a bunch of elves and all of those things. Like that's the physical thing that's Santa Claus. But actually the physical thing that's Santa Claus is a cultural pattern that persists in Western societies that, manifests at certain times a year. And we teach our children. It's a cultural pattern. It's a real physical thing. But Santa Claus is not the physical thing. Santa Claus is a cultural phenomena, is the physical thing. And so the words we use, I think sometimes we confuse with the reality that they're describing. And this is very apparent in social media all the time. Like people take like words or sets of relations to try to reveal the conceptual frameworks underlying them and the things that are happening in our minds that we're trying to communicate. But words are not exact maps to reality. They never have been. Yes. And this is why language evolves. And so when we say large language models are intelligent, or they're these alien others, to me that's very perplexing, because it's like the reality for a artificial intelligence right now is human labeled data. So they've been created by us, and all of their reality, all of the measurable features of the external world they get are data fed by us to them. So their entire conception of reality is human labeled data. And if that's not a direct lineage from us into other substrates and becoming sort of more of a culturally embedded thing, it's the externalization of the human. That's what it is. It's not creating something other than us. And I was also thinking of another sort of analogy. Like these analogies are all poor. So I think, when people hear me giving these analogies, they're just conceptual framings to reorient us. And I don't, I'm talking about language being imprecise. It's very imprecise. I'm trying to evoke kind of emotional states so we can get into a different reference frame. But the analogy I was thinking about was you're using the iPhone, but I was just thinking about human language and the way that we've recorded it. And so, I loved when LLMs came online and people were starting to talk about when we first started writing and being able to record written language, and how people thought the dead were speaking to them. And they thought that this was a kind of knowledge that people shouldn't have, and it should be very only specific people should have it. And it was very shocking, right? To be able to have someone's voice from past generations speak to you directly when that had never happened in human history. And now it's like you interact with a large language model, and you're not just interacting with a single person or a single record, you're interacting with a dynamical model of an entire society as it was recorded in the internet at a moment in time. Like that's a very existentially traumatic process for an individual to undergo when they've never had that experience before culturally. And the ways that information is stored kind of reminds me of going from like minerals, which were really limited substrates, to like genomes, which were much more fluid, dynamic kind of processing and storage of information. It's like you think about books as being like minerals and LLMs being more like genomes. But the real thing that we're doing is like thinking about like if you think about social structures as living entities and we're one component in those social structures, the technologies are also part of that ecosystem. And so I think we think too much of ourselves as the scale of life and not enough of the planet as the scale of life.
Right.
And the planet is the scale. This planet is alive and we are temporary instances of lineages of that construction process.
Here's something wonderful that you said. You said, I think we will be the core genetic architecture for AI. We will be like the DNA for AI.
Yeah.
Which I think is kind of a wonderful notion, because the idea is that in the same way that we are built out of simpler life forms, in fact, our bodies contain simpler life forms, we don't compete with them. In fact, we rely upon them.
Yeah.
Right? And we exist on different scales. Right. And so AI might turn into, in the coming decades, a more complex life form that exists on a different scale than we do and relies upon us, is what I read from your thinking. What is that right?
Yeah, no, I'm laughing because I basically just said that the AI were the DNA, and then I've also said that we're the DNA.
And you flipped it around.
But I'm totally comfortable with that because I think these analogies are very poor, and I think the point is that like we're not separate from them, and like it's it's a co-evolving system, and in some sense, like I was saying, like they're kind of the externalization of us into other substrates via our technology. But I did want to make a point about it. I don't really agree with most of Nick Bostrom's philosophy. I think it's philosophy is usually built on assumptions, and I think if your assumptions about your starting point are wrong, all the philosophy you build is going to be wrong. So I don't like most of his ideas. I don't like, but there was one thing he wrote that I really thought was pertinent in his regard. Is like, there has never been an immortal species on this planet, like an individual lineage, but what is persistent over time. And so like he made the argument that, AI or whatever more intelligent technologies were necessary in order to make an immortal lineage. Actually, I don't agree with that idea, actually, now as I say it. But I think what it sparked for me is just thinking about this continuity. Like, I think life is this most deterministic structure, and it's constructing its way into the future. And the sort of trajectory we see from biology and technology is part of that process because it leads to greater longevity of the process as a whole. But what you really need to think about in life is actually that entire lineage. Like, I think about life as being, I said, it's information structuring matter across space and time. If you think about the biosphere as a structure that persists across time, it's not just the size of our planet, it's 4 billion years deep in time. Like, that to me is what life is, that entire structure. Yeah. And so when I see us creating the things that we're creating now, to me, they're that process propagating in the future so it can keep going. And I don't see us as being a particularly special moment in time, but I love humans. So I'm not saying that. And I think like humans should exist as long as possible because I think we're pretty freaking amazing. But I think I want to put the whole process in context, I guess, and really understand that, these things are not inevitable, like they're not fully determined, and we have a lot of agency in it, but it's a co-constructed agency. Like, we're not just sitting by watching these things happen. Like, we are the process.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. Exactly. Right. And it's right. I mean, we have this notion, obviously we think of ourselves as something that's sort of desecrating the planet, or like interlopers, right? Yeah. But from the perspective of an alien, we're all a growth of our planet. And the same is true of our AI and our technosphere, as you say. I mean, there's some folks like Stuart Russell from Berkeley who we had on the show, and Nick Bostrom you mentioned, who would sort of point out that it's generally historically suboptimal to be the second most intelligent species on planet Earth, and so I've shared some of that anxiety, right? That if you don't think that there's some kind of magic pixie dust that resulted in human consciousness, or consciousness is not even necessary, right? Really, it's more like intelligence, or all that's necessary is a desire to survive. The combination of intelligence and a desire to survive ends up relegating chimpanzees to zoos and things. But I really like this notion of yours that actually this is LLMs are an intelligence that is built on top of our language and our global conversation that exists on an entirely different scale, and there's a symbiosis. I mean, I think that's really nice conceptually, and it makes me wonder whether, like, is there a tendency of male physicists and computer scientists to see relationships between us and AI as one of dominance and submission, versus like is there a possibility to see it more symbiotically? I don't know. What do you think?
I like literally do not understand the argument on a lot of levels, but this idea of like it's generally not great to be the second most intelligent species. Like I don't even know what that means, because I think some humans on this planet are treated worse than chimpanzees. I'm not like I don't want to make ethical comparisons, but what does that mean? And also, what would it mean to be like the second most intelligent cell in a body? And also, what is intelligence? Like, what is the metric? So I think one of the things that's really interesting right now is this whole focus on diverse intelligences. That's kind of parallel to this AI field stuff, is like just looking in the biosphere and trying to recognize the varieties and kinds of intelligence that persist, or even in bodies that like neurons are not the only intelligent cells. So I think it seems to me to be very very individual focused and very like Darwinian fittest focused. And fitness has always been, like this idea of like the best wins. But fitness is a really hard concept actually to define in biology, and because you have to do it after the fact, right? Like there's no prior notion of what the most fit is until it happens. And so I think these narratives are really easy looking backward. They're not easy looking forward. I don't think they have any predictive capacity or really tell us much about where we're going.
Yeah.
And also I don't tend to think about humans as the pinnacle of evolution on this planet, and somehow we've come to dominate it, and we're not. Like I think the biosphere generated lots of structures in its evolutionary history, and we happen to be one of them, and we're fulfilling a particular role in that process. But I don't view it as an endpoint, an individual thing. I just think they're just the wrong ways of framing it, and they're very antiquated.
Yeah. But how about the notion, though, that if we think of the expanse of time from an assembly theory perspective, right? And I love, this brings to mind another wonderful quote of yours: to evolve stars, planets, cells, and eventually cities, the universe literally had to get large enough in time to fit these objects, right? So we need a universe large enough in time to make it possible to evolve us and now the technosphere. However, with moving from a mechanism of natural selection to effectively intelligent design that we're carrying out now, one could imagine the construction of more complicated objects measured in by your assembly index to accelerate dramatically, like thousands of fold faster, right? Yeah. And so that must give one pause, right?
Yeah. So I should qualify. It's not. I think there are real reasons that we should be asking these questions. Like, I don't think it's bad. Yeah. I think the thing I want to push back on is a lot of the narratives that we use are, and we do this all the time. I mean, we're a storytelling species, so we build a lot of narratives. We use narratives for things that we confront that are new, that are from things that feel familiar, and they often don't fit the problem. And so a lot of the ways that we're talking about AI are just not correct because we've never encountered anything like this before. And I think it's just worth us taking a step back and actually thinking about what's really happening and starting from first principles rather than imposing our anthropocentric viewpoint on how we think about ourselves within our current phase of technological growth and our social evolution, and just saying that's the way reality is, therefore accelerationist, like as you were pointing out, like very almost megalomaniac. I don't know. There's just like some kind of ethos of like, it's like capitalism, religion, like all of these things that we have become, like they're so built into our social architecture that we're imposing them in this space. And people have religious views about AI. They have, they have economically incentivized views about AI. They have human power dynamics of hierarchy inform views of AI. And a lot of the time, they're not even consciously aware of where they're picking up these views of things.
Yeah,
So,
it's sort of zero-sum game thinking that tends to that humans tend to slide into. I think, right? Now,
I think there's ample evidence things are moving faster and things are changing. And I think also we happen to live in a generation where there were a lot of traumatic events. And something that I find also a little challenging right now is young people are very they tend to take the darkest view of reality.
Right.
And I think it would be good if we can think about where the optimism is and try to build that future, because whatever we do now is setting the pace of things.
Yes. Do you think we'll merge with AI?
I don't know what that means, merge, so again, it's kind of, there's a lot of things we talk about where I would love some precision, and then I could really understand what people are saying.
Well, there's Neuralase, Elon Musk company, and there's
Well, I think the idea that we're going to be augmented by our technology, I don't see any reason that won't happen. I feel like my cell phone's already it's hacking my brain how many times a day. I might as well have a chip in there. What difference does it make?
Yeah, right.
But that was kind of a little flippant. But I guess I think the point is, some of the things that we have now that exist in our social ecosystem that we feel completely comfortable and normal with, and children growing up today live in a completely different reality than children 30 years ago. Those things were unfathomable to them. I remember getting the internet as a child, and it's I tell my kids that, and they're like, "Did you have electricity?" And I'm like, but it's hilarious to think about, but it's true, because it's really hard to play. You see so much happen in your lifetime, and then new people are born, and they grow up in a world that looks almost nothing like the one that you were a child, and they don't have any ability to even understand where you came from. And this is why we have such a big generational divide. But I think it's important to keep that in mind. Of course, the future is going to look different than the present, and I hope it looks different.
Yes.
But in what ways will it look different, and how do we make sure that we're making something that's better than it has been is good. I don't know. I believe in infinitely, I don't know. You could always make everything better. Probably not. Not realistically.
Right. No, it seems to me we totally suffer from a status quo bias, right? We fear the future partly because we fear anything that's meaningfully different from what we're used to.
Right.
And, it does seem important to imagine very different futures that might be more beautiful in some ways, right? And I think even though I don't necessarily totally agree with David Chalmers' optimism in Reality Plus about our future in the metaverse, or Ray Kurzweil's optimism about our future merging with AI, I do think that I can't imagine those futures, and I think this idea that Ray Kurzweil puts forward, that we will be within a matter of decades 100 times smarter in terms of the speed at which we can think and the complexity of the things that we can comprehend. And that when you think of the sublime and the beautiful and the things that bring tears to our eyes, many of those things are based on an ability to appreciate the beauty of complexity.
Yeah.
And so there might be deeper depths of beauty, in these futures.
Yeah. I want to make one comment on this, because I think you're raising a lot of really interesting points. I think it's really hard for us to imagine the future. And I think in part it's because it hasn't happened yet. It literally, it doesn't exist yet. So it's hard to imagine. And I think we have a tendency to really think in a lot of science fiction and fantasy about the future, right? A lot of these things are fantastical narratives. They're not real reality narratives, because we don't know what it'll look like, and people are kind of free to imagine whatever they want. And I think that's good for us to do, because it allows us to kind of understand the landscape of our fears and our hopes for what the future looks like. But I really like Ken Liu's kind of take on predicting the future. So Ken's a science fiction writer. He really thinks a lot about our ability to imagine things. And he had this great point about how, if you look at photographs or drawings in the past of people's predictions of the future, the things that they imagine that didn't exist are almost never accurate. But the things that they put in the photo, he showed a photo of I don't know, some some drawing from like the 30s or 40s with like some fantastical robot and like things flying in the sky and stuff. And then there's like a robot maid in like the little black dress in front. And he's like, you still recognize that as a maid, right? There are some things that just persist from the past into the future. Those things are actually the ones that are most predictable. But the things that are totally new, like those are the ones that like we don't know how to anticipate. And I think it's really worth saying that the future is going to be novel. It's going to be different and it's going to be unexpected. And just bracing ourselves for that.
Yes.
What we're really talking about when we talk about the future are the existential problems we're dealing with now. Like these are the things now and how we want to talk about them and how we want to engineer the future. That's the conversation that we're having. We're not actually having a conversation about what the future looks like because we don't know.
Yes. As you say, imagination is important and it's a physical act. And it influences the future. I love this riff of yours.
Yes. I think it's pretty obvious that that must be true. And actually, because we've seen a lot of things that people imagine that became real physical things. And the example I like to use is rockets, which, humans imagined for a very long time before we understood physics enough and engineering principles enough to build them. So they were imagined ideas long before they became physical objects that exist. And I think the imagination to physical is a really interesting manifestation of the evolutionary process generally. Like things that are deep in time can become more and more to the surface and actually become physical objects as the process of construction unfolds and builds novelty. So I think that's really important. And I think we underappreciate imagination as a real physical thing. And I think we're at a really interesting moment in history because we have enough recorded history to understand ourselves. It's not just that we have these technologies we're being confronted with, but we have recorded history for a long enough period of time to have conversations about how for generations before, it was really different than it is now. And if you think about most of human history, especially like 100,000 years ago, that was not the case. Yeah, I just saw this great talk by Ronald Fletcher, who's an anthropologist, like talking about the fact that when we started building physical structures and we had recorded history that like humans had lived here before, we started really changing our social groups because, humans would migrate and they would actually see patterns of past people living there. And that really changes the nature of how you think about yourself when you start to recognize there were things like you before, right? So, and then you start to have social memory. And so I think contingency and history are real physical features of the universe, but I think the human species is only getting to the point where we actually recognize that as an observational fact because we have enough of our own recorded history to recognize that the history matters to where we are now. And the way that ideas play over time actually has determined the way that our planet has, like what has happened. Like our imagination now will determine features of the future. So I think it's good that we're imagining things because it does help shape the future, but it is not the future.
It's a choice, and imagining things that are positive, optimism, as you say, which is part of which guides your theories of physics to some degree, because it exerts a force, right? It actually exerts a force, and it is, and from a scientific perspective, imagining and describing and even talking about on a podcast optimistic and positive futures is actually something that is happening in physical space that can be measured and has a kind of rippling effect and in some cases results in futures. It expands the possibility space, as you might say.
Yeah, I like that you actually call it a force because, one of the more provocative ways that Lee and I talk about it, like I think there's a lot of things that we say that really provoke a lot of people to, kind of, turn their head and like think a little differently. But, like some of them haven't even made it out yet, like in published literature or really talk about publicly. But one of the things that we talk a lot about is the force of selection and selection being a fundamental force in the universe as like a really primary thing. And I think like when you're saying it's a force, it's driving us forward in time, like I think that's a real thing. Validating that and like showing that there's some real fundamental physics there is obviously a tall order. Working on it. But, like the key problem is the origin of life and what does it tell you about all these other things will be interesting and will have to play out in the future. I don't know what it's going to look like.
Well, you've got your work cut out for you in figuring out the origin of life, and then launching an original fashion brand. So you've got plenty of work to do, and you've fully convinced me, Sara, that you are in fact alive, and perhaps even more alive than the average person, measured, as you say, the more things that can be constructed by a given object, the more alive it is. I think you're extremely alive.
Thank you.
And,
I feel it. Like it's a very visceral feeling for me, which is also why I feel like free will is a real thing, because like I know people that have it, and you can recognize them from a mile away. You see how much agency they have in what they exert in the world.
Right.
And I think we can choose that, and I think we're pretty privileged in the time to be able to choose that.
Well, thank you for helping us all think more deeply about the miracle of existence. And it's such a fascinating conversation. Really appreciate your being with us today.
Thank you so much.
The morning after I spoke with Sara, something happened. Something that happens all too often. I woke up with one last question I couldn't get out of my head. I wanted to know, does all this thinking about the nature of life help Sara navigate her own life? When she thinks about the expansiveness of the possibility space of objects vast in time, such as herself, does it impact how she thinks about possibilities available to her? Sara kindly responded with a voice memo.
Yes, I do sometimes find thinking about life useful in my own life. I guess since I think very deeply about the nature of life, it kind of is embodied in all of my interactions in the world, and everything I do kind of circles back to this question about the fundamental nature of what we are. But as far as about how the expansiveness of possibility space impacts my thinking, I think it most informs the degree of agency that I think that we have as far as being capable of constructing new possibilities and actually moving into the future as an active process and not a passive one. And I really do try to embody that in my own life and the level of agency that I exert in my day-to-day life and the things that I want to accomplish. So I guess the short answer is yes.
Thank you, Sara. And thank you, listener, for going on this wild ride with us. If you'd like to spend more time in Sara's world, pick up a copy of Life as No One Knows It, The Physics of Life's Emergence, wherever you buy your books. If you enjoyed this episode, I think you'll also like some of our other mind-bending, cutting-edge conversations about science with folks like Sam Harris, Don Hoffman, Steven Pinker, Robert Sapolsky, and Lisa Feldman Barrett. We've gathered all those episodes in a handy-dandy playlist, which you can find in the episode notes. Today's show is engineered by Mike Toda and produced by Caleb Bissinger. The Next Big Idea is a proud member of the LinkedIn Podcast Network. I'm your host, Rufus Griscom. More to come.